How's it going? Tyler Brown here with Productive Woodworking, and today I'm going to show you how I built this shadow box picture frame to remember our family's first beach trip. The first thing I did was rip down the Peruvian walnut into 2-inch wide strips. Next, I decided to cut out the dados where the plexiglass panels would fit into the frame. In this case, I cut out one dado 1/8 of an inch from the front of the frame, and the second 3/4 of an inch from the front. Once the dados were cut, I then trimmed each of the 4 sides of the picture frame at a 45-degree angle. I first clamped a 3/4 inch block as a reference point on my table saw fence. This allowed me to use the fence to measure the cuts and provide the space when the workpiece is pushed through the blade so that it doesn't bind and cause any kickback. The length of each piece ended up being 12 inches long. This allowed for an 8x10 picture and room at the bottom for the sand and seashells. Next, I sanded all 4 sides of each of the frame up to 220 grit. Next, I started to assemble the frame. To do this, I lined up the sides and applied painter's tape to each of the corners. I flipped over the pieces and applied glue to only 2 of the 90-degree corners. This is important because I'm creating a sort of time capsule with the sand and seashells sealed between 2 layers of plexiglass. I then rolled up the frame and used painter's tape on the last corner, which held each of the corners in place and acted as my clamping pressure. While the glue dried on the frame, I began to mill down some hard maple for the splines. Things were going well until I neared 1/8 of an inch when the planer took a large bite out of my board. So to cut the splines, I set my fence to 1/2 of an inch and placed a clamp on the fence as a depth stop for the cut. I made countless test cuts off camera to get the perfect combination of blade height and fence stop to make a symmetrical cut on both sides of the corner. Now, I'm probably going to get some hate in the comments on the method I used, but all I can say is it worked. The next step was to cut the plexiglass panels to size. I laid out the measurements on the plexiglass and clamped the piece to my workbench. I then lined up the straight edge guide with the marks and began to score the plexiglass. After scoring a few times, I removed the clamps and snapped the cut on the edge of my workbench. I then proceeded to cut 2 pieces of plexiglass to fit inside the frame. While I was on the same track of mine, I headed back over to the table saw and cut a back panel to hold the picture in place. I ended up using 1/4 inch MDF that I had left over from another project. Before adding the plexiglass to the frame, I pre-finished the inside of the frame, which would be impossible to reach once the plexiglass is installed. For this project, I used Osmo Natural, and I applied it using a 3M finishing pad that I cut down. I love using this type of oil wax finish because it's completely foolproof. You just buff it on and remove any excess that isn't absorbed into the wood. Next, I added some clear silicone into the dado on the frame. This will create a good seal around the plexiglass so the sand doesn't work its way out. I then slid the plexiglass into place and repeated the same steps for the second piece. Now that both plexiglass panels were in place, it was time to add the sand and seashells from the beach. I added the sand and seashells to make sure it would cover the void below the picture and wouldn't cover up too much of the picture as well. I then glued up the top piece of the frame, effectively creating a time capsule by sealing the sand and seashells into the frame. The next step is to add the hard maple splines. This is pretty straightforward. I just applied some glue to the splines and shoved them into place. Once the glue dried, I came back with a flush trim saw to get them trimmed down. I then sanded all 4 sides flush, removing any glue and getting the splines to look perfect. Next, I applied the finish to the outsides of the frame. And again, I am using Osmo Natural and applying it with a 3M finishing pad. To finish it off, I cut a custom matting from cardstock, added a family picture from our first beach trip, and the MDF backing. To hold the picture and backing in place, I pushed in some glazier points. Overall, this project turned out great. I'm loving the contrast between the hard maple splines and the Peruvian walnut. And this is definitely going to be something that my wife and I keep forever. So, if you learned something from this video or you enjoyed the content, please hit that thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.